You know, it is it is wild to think about, but by the time you go to sleep tonight, your heart will have beaten roughly 100,000 times today.
Yeah, I mean, that is a massive number when you really stop to visualize it.
Right. 100,000 times. And you didn't have to think about a single one of those beats. You didn't like schedule it on your calendar or consciously flex a muscle. It just happened in the background.
Completely on autopilot.
Exactly. But when you stop and actually consider the sheer mechanical reliability of that, I mean, you have to ask, what is pulling the strings? Like, what is setting that rhythm day in and day out, every single minute of your entire life?
It's the ultimate biological metronome, really. And the answer to what sets that rhythm completely upends how most of us assume our bodies work. Because, we usually think of the brain as the absolute dictator of everything the body does.
Right. The brain is the boss.
Exactly. But the heart operates on an entirely different paradigm.
And that is the exact mission of today's deep dive. We are unpacking the anatomy and the physiology of the heart's electrical system, trying to figure out exactly what sets the rhythm. And I mean, the very first thing we need to clear up is this massive plot twist in the sources.
Yeah, the big reveal.
Right. This quote-unquote electrical system that we are talking about isn't actually a nervous system at all.
Which is so counterintuitive. Because when we hear electrical signals in the body, our minds immediately go to, well, the brain, the spinal cord, nerves. That is our standard mental model.
The wiring.
Right, the wiring. But the cardiac conduction system is essentially a network of modified muscle cells. They are specialized cardiac muscle cells that have basically traded away their ability to contract.
Like to physically squeeze.
Exactly. They gave that up in exchange for the ability to spontaneously generate and conduct electricity.
So they basically gave up the brawn for the brains, essentially.
That's a brilliant way to frame it, yeah. They sacrifice physical strength for electrical control. And understanding how this specific dedicated network of cells operates, I mean, it changes how we view our own biology.
Oh, absolutely.
It explains how your morning cup of coffee actually makes your heart race. It explains why life-saving medical devices like pacemakers have to be engineered the way they are. And it resolves some of the most fundamental medical mysteries of the human body.
I actually want to start with one of those historical mysteries because before modern medicine could even, look at how the system works today, there was a massive, decades-long argument over what the electrical system even was in the first place.
Oh, yeah, it was a huge controversy.
Right. Back in the 19th century, physiologists were basically split into two warring camps.
This was known as the Great Neurogenic versus Myogenic Debate. And I know it sounds like a dusty academic dispute, but it was actually a fundamental fight over how human life functions.
High stakes for biology.
Very high stakes. So the neurogenic camp believed that the heartbeat originated in nerve ganglia.
Which are like little clusters of nerve cells, right?
Little clusters embedded inside the heart tissue.
Which, honestly, to be fair to them, makes logical sense on the surface. Because if I want to move my bicep, my brain sends a nerve impulse down my arm. No nerve impulse, no contraction. So they just assumed the heart had to be wired up the exact same way.
Right. They were borrowing the logic from skeletal muscle and just, applying it to the heart. But then you had the myogenic theory camp. Myo meaning muscle. Myo meaning muscle, meaning origin.
Okay.
And this camp argued that the heart muscle tissue itself was the origin of the beat. In their view, the nerves were just there to modulate it, maybe speed it up or slow it down. But the actual spark was generated by the muscle all on its own.
And history gives us this incredible story in the sources about a British physiologist in the 1880s named Walter Gaskell, who basically went to war for the myogenic theory. And his methods were, well, brilliantly, almost brutally simple.
They really were.
He took tortoise and frog hearts, and he physically tied ligatures, just tight strings around different sections of the heart, to physically block the conduction between the chambers.
And Gaskell's observations from those experiments were completely groundbreaking. He found that if he took isolated strips of heart muscle, meticulously ensuring there was absolutely no nerve tissue attached to them whatsoever, they just kept beating.
That is just wild to me.
Right. Rhythmically, on their own, in a dish.
It is almost spooky to think about. Just an isolated piece of tissue beating away without a brain anywhere nearby.
It's definitely a bit unsettling if you're used to the idea that your brain controls everything. But Gaskell also showed that if he placed a physical block between the top chambers, the atria, and the bottom chambers, the ventricles, the ventricle would stop following the top chamber's rhythm.
It would just pause.
It would pause, yeah. But after a short pause, The ventricle would just start beating on its own, at its own slower, independent rate. And this was really the first concrete proof that the muscle had what we call automaticity, and that the heart had a built-in hierarchy of pacemakers.
But even with Gaskell's frogs, it took, what, another 70 years to actually map this system out anatomically?
Pretty much, yeah.
I mean, you had Jan Evangelista Purkinje discovering his conductive fibers back in 1839, though he mistakenly thought they were just connective tissue. Then Wilhelm His Jr. discovering the bundle of his in 1893. But the real breakthrough happened in 1907, right? With two British anatomists, Arthur Keith and Martin Flack.
Yes. And the circumstances of their discovery are fantastic.
They are literally on a summer holiday. And what do two anatomists do on a summer holiday?
They dissect things, obviously.
Obviously. So they're meticulously dissecting this tiny mole's heart. And while they're doing this, they stumble upon a microscopic knot of specialized tissue up in the right atrium, and they realize this is it. This is the true origin of the heartbeat, the sinoatrial node, or the SE node.
The literal ignition switch of the heart. And, it's worth noting that right as they were mapping this anatomy under a microscope, a Dutch physiologist named Willem Einthoven was figuring out how to actually measure that electrical spark clinically.
Oh, right, around 1901.
Exactly. He built the first practical electrocardiogram, the ECG.
Okay, I have to pause you on the word practical, because the visual of Einthoven's original machine is completely absurd by today's standards.
Oh, it was a monster.
His string galvanometer used these massive electromagnets. It was so huge it needed its own dedicated room. And to get a good electrical contact, the patient had to sit there with their arms and legs submerged in heavy buckets of saline solution.
Yeah, it was incredibly cumbersome. I mean, imagine going to the doctor with chest pain, and they just bring out 3 buckets of salt water for you to stand in.
Pull up your pants, sir. Time for your heart test.
Exactly. But, the science was sound. Einthoven won a Nobel Prize for it. His machine proved the myogenic theory once and for all by capturing the electrical wave traveling through the heart muscle itself.
So if I'm thinking about this in modern computing terms, it means the heart isn't like a computer monitor just sitting there waiting for the brain's hard drive to send it a signal to wake up. The heart is its own completely self-contained server.
Yes.
It generates its own power, runs its own code, and just operates independently.
That is a highly accurate way to look at it. The heart is its own closed-loop system.
I am a bit tripped up here, though. If this server is just running completely on autopilot, if the brain isn't the ignition switch, how does a heart cell just decide to fire? Like, how does anything biological happen without a chemical or a nerve telling it to go?
This brings us to first principles and a biological concept called automaticity.
Okay. Think about most of the cells in your body. Your neurons, your skeletal muscles. They sit at a stable negative resting charge. We call it a resting membrane potential.
Right.
And they are perfectly content to sit there forever, completely dormant, until they receive a strong external stimulus. But the pacemaker cells in that SA node are completely different. Their membrane potential never actually stabilizes.
They biologically cannot sit still.
Exactly the opposite of stable. After every single heartbeat, the cell tries to repolarize, meaning it tries to reset its electrical charge back to that negative baseline so it can rest. But the moment it gets down to that resting state, there is an inward leak.
A leak?
Yeah, it's a mixed sodium and potassium current that begins slowly leaking positive charge back into the cell.
And biology gives this leak the greatest name imaginable. It's called the funny current.
The funny current, designated simply as I sub F in the literature. And it got that name because from a strict electrophysiological standpoint, it behaves incredibly oddly.
How? Well, most cellular channels open when a cell gets stimulated or becomes more positive. The funny current channels open when the cell becomes highly negative. It works backward compared to standard voltage-gated currents.
So instead of a light switch that waits for a finger to flip it on, this funny current is more like, well, it's more like a bucket with a tiny hole in the bottom sitting underneath a dripping faucet.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
It just slowly fills up with positive charge on its own, completely passively. And once that bucket overflows, boom, it flushes, the cell fires, and the process starts all over again.
That is the perfect analogy. It keeps drifting higher and higher until it crosses a critical threshold and it fires entirely on its own. This is the literal mechanical origin of a self-generated rhythm. No brain required, just a leaky bucket of sodium and potassium ions.
Okay, so the funny current is the spark. It's happening in the SA node, sitting high up in the right atrium. But the SA node isn't the only part of the heart that has these leaky buckets, right? The system has a built-in hierarchy of backup generators.
It features an incredibly robust redundancy system. The SA node is the primary pacemaker because its bucket fills the fastest.
Right.
If you remove all nerve influence, its true intrinsic rate is about 100 to 110 beats per minute, though usually our resting bodies rein it in to about 60 to 100. And because it is the fastest, it dominates the whole heart through a process called overdrive suppression.
Meaning it fires and resets everything else before the slower cells even have a chance to overflow their own buckets.
Precisely. But if the SA node breaks down or the tissue around it gets damaged, the next generator automatically kicks in. The next in line is the AV node, the atrioventricular node, sitting lower down between the upper and lower chambers.
And what's its backup speed?
If left to its own devices, its funny current will cause it to fire at about 40 to 60 beats per minute. And if even the AV node fails, the Purkinje fibers deep in the bottom of the ventricles will take over at an even slower rate of 20 to 40 beats per minute.
This is exactly like a twin-engine airplane having a primary engine, a backup engine, and then a final emergency glide system.
That's a great way to think about it.
And there is a real-world medical condition that illustrates this perfectly called third degree or complete heart block. If you're a patient with this, the electrical connection between your top chambers and bottom chambers is totally severed. The SA node is screaming away up top, but the signal just can't get through to the bottom.
Right. And in a poorly designed system, that would be an immediate fatal flaw. The ventricles just wouldn't get the signal to pump.
But because of this backup system, your ventricles just shrug and settle into their own slower 20 to 40 beat per minute rhythm. I mean, if you were that patient, you would be profoundly fatigued. Sure, you'd likely pass out, and you would definitely need a synthetic pacemaker implanted immediately.
Oh, without a doubt.
But you wouldn't be dead purely because of this cellular safety net.
That redundancy is the only thing keeping you alive in that scenario.
So we have the spark from the funny current, we have the backup generators. Now let's trace how the signal actually travels. It cascades down a very specific pathway. It starts in the SA node, ripples through the atria, hits the AV node, goes down the bundle of His, splits into the bundle branches, and finally spreads out through the Purkinje fibers.
That's the route, yep.
But there is a mechanical reality to this pathway that seems completely counterintuitive to me. The system intentionally slows the signal down.
It does. It deliberately hits the brakes right in the middle of the sequence.
Why in the world would it do that? Usually in biology and definitely in electrical engineering, you want signals to move as fast as possible. Efficiency is the whole point. This feels like putting a massive speed bump in the middle of a superhighway.
It's a highly counterintuitive feature, I'll give you that.
Yeah.
But it highlights how electrical engineering in the body is subservient to mechanical realities. Let's look at the speeds.
Okay, lay 'em on me.
The electrical signal moves through the atrial muscle up top at about 0.3 to 0.5 meters per second. But when it hits the AV node, that velocity drops to an absolute crawl, about 0.02 to 0.05 meters per second.
Wow, that is a huge drop.
Yeah, it creates a delay of about 1/10 of a second.
A literal biological speed bump. But how does it physically slow down electricity? Does it just use different wiring?
Essentially, yes. The cells inside the AV node are physically smaller, and crucially, they have far fewer gap junctions.
Gap junctions.
Yeah, gap junctions are like tiny doors connecting one cell to the next, allowing the electrical ions to flow through. Fewer doors mean a massive increase in electrical resistance. The signal gets bottlenecked.
Okay, so structurally, I understand how the speed bump works, but why do we need it?
Think about what the heart actually does. It is a plumbing mechanism. It's a pump. If the electrical signal flashed instantly from the top of the heart to the bottom without any resistance, the atria and the ventricles would squeeze at the exact same time. The top chambers wouldn't have time to actually push their blood down into the bottom chambers before the heavy bottom chambers forcefully clamped shut.
Oh, wow. So the electrical delay is an engineered mechanical advantage. It holds the signal back just long enough for the top of the plumbing to finish pushing its payload into the basement.
Exactly. It lets the atria finish emptying, and once the signal is allowed past that AV node checkpoint, it hits the bundle of His and the Purkinje fibers, which act completely differently. They are the fastest conducting tissues in the whole heart. They rocket the signal at 2 to 4 meters per second.
Because they have wide cells and tons of those gap junction doors, right?
Right. And that immense speed ensures that all the muscle at the bottom of the heart, the massive, thick walls of the ventricles, contracts in near unison. That produces a powerful, coordinated upward squeeze rather than a slow, useless ripple.
What happens if someone is just biologically born without that speed bump? If you're listening to this and wondering why some people have random bouts of a terrifyingly fast heart rate, it all comes back to this AV node delay.
It really does. There is a well-known condition called Wolff-Parkinson-White, or WPW syndrome. In WPW, a person is born with an abnormal extraelectrical pathway of tissue, sometimes called the bundle of Kent, and this pathway completely bypasses the AV node.
So it's a rogue detour highway that completely goes around the toll booth.
That's a great visual. The electrical signal takes the bypass and reaches the ventricles too early. It pre-excites them. Normally, the AV node protects the ventricles. If the top chambers start firing chaotically, say, 300 times a minute during an episode of atrial fibrillation.
Which is bad.
Very bad. Well, the AV node acts as a shield, refusing to conduct every single one of those crazy signals down to the bottom.
But with the WPW bypass highway, there is no shield.
Exactly. Those rapid, dangerous signals can conduct straight down into the ventricles at full speed. The ventricles try to pump 300 times a minute, which they mechanically cannot do, and it can create incredibly fast, potentially lethal arrhythmias. The AV node bottleneck isn't a design flaw, it's a vital protective shield.
I feel like we have a complete picture of the hardware now. The heart runs its own ignition with the leaky buckets of the funny current, it has backup generators, and it perfectly manages its own internal speed bumps. Which brings me back to my earlier confusion. If the heart is a self-contained server, why do I have nerves going to it at all? What is the nervous system actually doing?
The nervous system is the ultimate modulator. The nerves don't start the engine, they just control the throttle.
Okay.
You have the vagus nerve, which is a major highway of the parasympathetic system, your rest and digest mode. It releases a chemical called acetylcholine directly onto the SA node to slow that funny current down. It's a constant brake.
And the other side?
Then you have the sympathetic chain, your fight or flight mode, which releases norepinephrine to speed the leak up when you need to run.
So the SA node is the engine's ignition, and the brain's nerves are just the driver stepping on the gas or the brake pedal.
That's it. And the most elegant, undeniable proof of this comes from modern heart transplant patients. When a surgeon transplants a donor heart into a recipient's chest, they sever all the nerve connections. The autonomic nerve fibers are physically cut, and modern surgery cannot reconnect them. The recipient receives a completely denervated heart.
The ultimate version of Walter Gaskell's isolated frog heart. No strings attached, literally, but the moment they restore blood flow in the operating room.
It beats. It beats immediately and rhythmically. The SA node's automaticity just takes over. But because the vagus nerve is no longer attached to act as a constant resting brake pedal, transplant patients typically have a noticeably higher resting heart rate.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. Instead of sitting at 60 to 80 beats per minute, they might comfortably sit around 90 to 100.
Because the funny current is just running at its natural intrinsic speed, completely unbothered by a brain telling it to chill out.
Yes. And even more fascinating, if a transplant patient starts to exercise, say they jump on a treadmill, they don't get that instantaneous spike in heart rate that you or I would get from a direct nerve signal.
Wait, how do they get their heart rate up then?
They actually have to wait a few moments for the circulating adrenaline from their adrenal glands to physically travel through the bloodstream and wash over the heart tissue before the heart rate catches up to their physical exertion.
That is just incredible. But speaking of medical marvels, we have to talk about what happens when the SA node totally fails.
Yeah.
And we have to step in with our own technology. We mentioned pacemakers earlier, but the history of the very first fully implantable pacemaker is wild.
Oh, you're referring to the case of Arne Larsson in Sweden back in 1958.
Yes, Arne Larsson. He is suffering from severe heart block, passing out constantly. He receives this device, implanted by a surgeon named Eik Senning, and built by an engineer named Rune Elmqvist. And this isn't modern tech, this is 1958. They are potting the electronics in epoxy resin using a simple shoe polish tin as a mold.
A shoe polish tin.
Yes, and the first unit fails within hours.
Well, the human body is an incredibly hostile environment for electronics. It's warm, it's wet, it's full of corrosive salt water, and the heart is violently moving 100,000 times a day. Wires snap, batteries fail.
The second one they put in him lasts about a week. But Larsson didn't give up. Over his lifetime, as biomedical engineering slowly figured out how to survive inside the chest cavity, Larsson received roughly 26 different pacemakers. Every time the technology improved, he got an upgrade.
His body essentially became the proving ground for decades of cardiovascular engineering.
And the kicker, he lived to be 86 years old, passing away in 2001. He actually outlived both the surgeon who implanted the first device and the engineer who built it.
That is amazing.
26 pacemakers. It really highlights how well we've learned to interface directly with this electrical grid. Which leads us to look at how the medical world interacts with this system today in emergency rooms. And there are some massive public misconceptions we need to clear up based on the sources.
There are huge misunderstandings out there, largely driven by how emergency medicine is dramatically portrayed in television and movies.
Let's ruin some medical TV dramas, because there is a huge misconception about the ECG, the electrocardiogram. We all know the visual, the spiky lines moving across the monitor with a rhythmic beep. People assume that those spikes show the heart physically pumping blood.
That is a dangerous assumption. An ECG records strictly electrical activity. It is capturing the wave of depolarization moving through the tissue. It does not measure the mechanical contraction at all.
Right.
And clinically, understanding that distinction can be life or death.
Right.
There is a terrifying condition called pulseless electrical activity, or PEA.
Pulseless electrical activity. I mean, the name kind of gives away the horror of it.
In PEA, if you're looking at the ECD monitor, you might see perfectly organized, normal-looking electrical signals. The SA node is firing, the signal is successfully moving down through the AV node and the Purkinje fibers. But the muscle itself, whether due to massive blood loss, toxins, or severe damage, isn't responding. The heart produces no effective pump action at all.
Wow.
Electricity is there, but the mechanics have failed.
It's like the server is sending the print job perfectly, but the printer is jammed.
Wow.
This is why you can never rely solely on a screen. An ECG cannot confirm if a patient actually has a pulse or is circulating blood. And here's the other major TV trope we have to dismantle: defibrillation.
Oh, this one is everywhere.
On every medical show, a patient's monitor flatlines into a solid, continuous tone. The doctor yells, "Clear!" They shock the patient with the paddles, and the heart miraculously jumpstarts back to life.
It makes for highly dramatic television, but it's entirely backwards from a physiological standpoint. A defibrillator absolutely does not jumpstart a stopped heart. If the heart is completely flatlined, a state called asystole shocking, it will do absolutely nothing.
Wait, really? So what is a defibrillator actually doing when they shock someone?
It is delivering a massive, instantaneous dose of electricity that forcibly depolarizes essentially every single cardiac cell at the exact same time. Think about a condition like ventricular fibrillation, where the electrical signals have become completely chaotic.
It's just a mess of signals.
Yeah, thousands of cells are firing out of turn, the funny currents are overflowing at random, and the heart is just quivering like a bag of worms instead of pumping. The shock wipes the slate clean. It stops all the chaos, creating a brief, intentional flatline.
I need to make sure I'm following this. You shock the chaotic quivering to intentionally create a total flatline.
Yes, you silence the noise. By depolarizing everything at once, you force all those leaky buckets to empty simultaneously. And then you wait, hoping that the dominant pacemaker, the SA node, with the fastest funny current, will step back up to the microphone, reassert its overdrive suppression, and start a normal, coordinated rhythm again.
That is wild.
You aren't starting the engine, you are forcefully turning the computer off and on again, hoping the primary operating system boots up correctly.
That completely changes how I'll watch those hospital shows. You're just hitting the hard reset button. And this electrical grid is so well mapped out now that we actually have everyday prescription drugs designed to target very specific parts of it.
Modern cardiology relies heavily on this map. Beta blockers, for example, work by physically blocking the receptors for that sympathetic nerve input we discussed, preventing the adrenaline from speeding up the SA and AV nodes.
Ah, okay.
There's a fascinating drug called ivabradine that directly targets and blocks that specific funny current channel, slowing the heart rate without affecting how hard the muscle physically squeezes.
That's incredibly specific.
It really is. And digoxin, an older but famous plant-derived drug, works by intentionally increasing the resistance through the AV node speed bump. This is incredibly useful if the top of the heart is firing out of control and you want to strengthen that bottleneck to protect the ventricles.
It all comes back to managing the leaky buckets and the speed bumps. So, to recap this amazing biological journey, we started with 19th century physiologists tying strings around frog hearts, moving to buckets of saline solution to capture the first ECGs.
What a visual.
We unpacked the funny current that gives the heart its automaticity, marveling at the backup generators that keep us alive when the main ignition fails. We realized that the AV node's massive slowdown is actually a brilliant mechanical feature for plumbing, not a biological bug. And we saw how pacemakers, defibrillators, and daily medications all hinge on understanding the self-driving, beautifully engineered electrical grid.
It truly is a marvel of biological engineering. And, as we wrap up today's deep dive, there's one final, somewhat profound detail from our material that I'd love for you, our listener, to mull over.
Let's hear it.
We mentioned earlier that if you take single cardiac muscle cells and isolate them in a petri dish, they will each twitch independently at their own individual rates, driven by their own funny currents.
Wait, the ultimate proof of the myogenic theory.
But the data notes something extraordinary. If those independently beating cells are allowed to physically touch each other in that dish to form those microscopic gap junction doors, they immediately synchronize.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the slower cell adapts, and they begin beating in perfect unison, locking into the rhythm of the faster cell.
They just automatically sync up the moment they make contact.
Immediately. And I want you to consider what that implies about life at a fundamental level. At our microscopic core, our very cells are biologically mandated to communicate, to compromise, and to move in unison the moment they connect with one another. It makes you wonder, could this innate biological drive for synchronized rhythm exist in other parts of our biology? Does this micro-level need to find a shared beat influence how whole organisms, perhaps even humans, interact with one another in the natural world?
That is a staggering thought. That connection and synchrony aren't just high-level social concepts, but biological imperatives written into the very ion channels of the cells that keep us alive. It makes those 100,000 heartbeats you'll have today feel a lot less like a cold mechanical process and a lot more like a continuous, microscopic symphony of cooperation. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep wondering, keep learning, and we'll catch you next time.